Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about different powers that the federal government has, since we were talking a little bit about federalism in the last video. And then you can see down here in a couple of slides, we're going to bring it all together in relation to the amendments. So in the last video, we talked about Congress's power to tax and how that affects the balance of federalism. Now we're going to talk about the president's power to enforce laws. So the legislative branch can challenge how faithfully the president is executing laws and can essentially tell the president that they need to be more effectively executed. The president has the main responsibility of enforcing or executing the laws as they are written by the Congress and as they are interpreted by the judicial branch through judicial review. So that is his power. The president has pretty free power when it comes to enforcing laws, thanks to that elastic clause. But there are still checks and balances that happen to make sure that they don't go too overboard in creating a police state or that they are not enforcing them well enough. The judicial branch, which is Article 3 of the Constitution, the Congress can impact the practice of the judicial branch by establishing or abolishing inferior, read lower, courts. This can limit or expand the authority and scope of the court. So no one's ever going to be able to get rid of the Supreme Court because it's the head of the branch. But the number of federal courts that we have through all 50 states and 2 territories are the numbers determined by the Congress. So if the Congress feels like there's too much interference through judicial review, they can technically shrink the number of courts that are present in the United States government system. So if we're going to bring it all together, we need to understand how the amendments are technically organized. So on the surface, it's just 27 singular amendments. However, most of them follow a theme. So there are several different ways we can organize them, but there's a way that makes them easier to understand and to chunk. So these clusters are based on the topics or issues that the amendments deal with. Let's take a look. So starting out in the Reconstruction era, following the conclusion of the Civil War, the federal government had to work to keep the states together. In an effort to do so, 3 important amendments were created. 13th Amendment, slavery is officially abolished in all U.S. states. The 14th Amendment addresses the issue of citizenship for former slaves, because between the time of the 13th and 14th Amendment, these people did not willingly come to the United States. They were brought here. So what kind of citizenship rights should we grant them? And there was a lot of discrimination based off of that. So it just made it easier for everyone. If, former slaves now become citizens, they can actually partake in theory, they can actually partake in government exercise. And then with the passage of the 15th Amendment, African-American males earn the right to vote. So we're still seeing prejudice based on sex, but not so much on race as far as the Constitution is concerned. Now, unfortunately, these 3 amendments left a ton of loopholes that could be exploited in order to still make it really, really difficult for African Americans, now American citizens, to vote, participate in government, hold office, receive a fair education, really just about anything. The Progressive Era, as many Americans began to make money from the rapid increase in industrialization and a willing labor force, the right of the people became very important to certain groups. People were being abused by business owners, by people who were working them to death. At this point, there are no, there's no such thing as, hey, a 40-hour work week with overtime. It's you work until we tell you to go home, and, maybe we'll pay you on time. So there was an abuse of workers' rights and management of workers. And so these following amendments were supposed to protect the rights and kind of through the transverse of it, the morals of American society. So 16th Amendment is the federal income tax. The idea is that with more money coming in to the government, there's more opportunities to provide money for like adequate housing, adequate infrastructure, so that you don't have millions of people just living on top of each other in squalor. The 17th Amendment, the direct election of U.S. senators, allows for increased representation so that people's voices are heard more loudly in Congress. The 18th Amendment's interesting because it is a prohibition of alcohol. So this is like the only amendment that deals with, hey, don't do this thing, right? So the idea behind the 18th Amendment was that alcohol is just this thing that makes people act stupid. And so we don't need that because you've got drunk husbands coming home from work and beating their wives, and that's seen as a problem in society. It is a big problem in society. But it's this idea that if we remove alcohol from the equation, then, the moral good of the people will start to shine through. And then in the 19th Amendment, we see women fight and earn for the right to vote. So this is the progressive era. We're making a lot of huge societal steps, a lot of huge, not necessarily government-related steps, but, representing people, providing more goods and services for people, trying to get them to be on like a better path. And we'll talk about the 18th Amendment a little bit more here in just a second. Disenfranchised groups. So disenfranchised groups are just groups of people that are given little to no power in society or government. So think about your minorities. Think about the way some people with disabilities have been treated. Color of your skin, socioeconomic status, are you really given the same amount of power if you live below the poverty line as someone who makes 6 figures a year? Men versus women. So we're talking about these kinds of things. These following amendments further the constitutional rights of disenfranchised groups. So the 15th Amendment, which we've already talked about, basically says, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, read into that slavery, people may now vote. Okay. 19th Amendment, your right to vote cannot be challenged on the basis of your sex or gender. 24th Amendment, your right to vote cannot be based off of your ability to pay a poll tax. So now states cannot charge a tax to go vote. Voting is free. 26th Amendment, any person over the age of 18 may vote. So you see the color of your skin, your sex or gender, your ability to pay, and your age. So all of these things are considered disenfranchised. Minority groups, women, people who live below the poverty line, and people of a certain age can now be active in their government. That's what these amendments were trying to address. Presidential amendments. So these deal directly with the President of the United States, with Article 2 of the Constitution, to try and shore up a few issues that we realized we had. So the 12th Amendment, President and Vice President are elected together. So, if you're walking down the street right now in July of 2020, you see, Trump-Pence signs. So they're running together. If they're elected, Donald Trump will be president again, and Mike Pence will be vice president again. When the Constitution was first ratified, it was done in ranked order. So whoever received the most votes became president. Whoever received the second most votes became vice president. The problem with this was that you had people from 2 different political parties often working together in the White House, so they would be too busy fighting to actually do government. And that's a problem. So this was made to keep government moving a little bit faster. The 20th Amendment, terms begin and end on January 20th for president and VPs. Basically, it used to be that presidents and vice presidents didn't take office until March, but as travel became not on horseback and you could drive a car or ride a train, they shortened it up to January 20th, so there wasn't such a lame duck period from the election in November to when the new president actually took office. 22nd Amendment passed after FDR, 2-term limit on presidencies. So, FDR was elected 4 times. We didn't want to see this American monarchy or oligarchy kind of come into play. So we set term limits on the presidents. The 23rd Amendment, Washington, D.C. earns the right to vote. Since Washington, D.C. is not technically a state, they were not allowed to vote up until this time for the president. And, after Congress realized that there were hundreds of thousands of residents in D.C. who were technically American citizens but didn't have a say, representation is kind of a big deal in our government. So we passed this amendment. The 25th Amendment just secured the line of presidential succession. So if you look at the different assassinations or deaths in office of American presidents, what you'll find is that people weren't sure who took over after the president died or was unable to do their job. And there was this fear that there would be like a military style coup, and a military leader would just assume power, and that's a problem when you're trying to have a democratic republic. So this basically set up the line of order for who takes over if something happens to the president. So if something happens to the president, the vice president steps up. Something happens to the vice president, then the Speaker of the House steps up, so on and so forth. So it was very important in terms of how we operate our government in case of an emergency. Unique amendments, they were ratified in order to address unique historical circumstances. So the 11th Amendment, citizens can't sue the state that they don't live in. This was following the Revolutionary War, where, if a state militia came through and occupied your home and it got burned down, who's responsible for paying for it? Like, if it was the New York militia that came through and you live in Georgia and your house got destroyed, well, then who's going to pay for it? Well, we decided that, you're going to take cases like that up to the Supreme Court. You can't just sue them in regular court. 21st Amendment, like we talked about, repeals or cancels out the 18th Amendment. So that was kind of a big deal. And then the 27th, which is kind of weird, congressional pay raises don't take effect until the next term. Basically, you had a bunch of politicians voting to give themselves pay raises indiscriminately. So we passed an amendment that basically says, if you're going to give yourself pay raises, you're going to have to be reelected to actually get that money. So kind of cool, kind of a good idea, I think. And these last couple of slides are just the amendment review list, so 1 through 27. And you'll see that there's a link for a Quizlet right there that you can click on in the slideshow. You can see here that ARL just means Amendment Review List. As you can see, it's just everything we talked about. So you can use that for your own review purposes. A little self-check quiz for you there that you can use. Feel free to use these resources at will. So thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it.